Welcome to an extensive exploration of one of the most profoundly unsettling chapters in American annals. Please let us know your location, as today's narrative plunges into the foreboding peaks of North Carolina, a dominion where the rule of law was merely a whispered concept, and familial secrets could lie dormant for countless generations. The year is 1849. The nascent nation is still mending from the recent conflict with Mexico. California's burgeoning gold rush beckons throngs westward, promising fortunes untold. Yet, nestled within the embrace of North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains, time itself appears to be suspended in a bygone epoch. Here, the pathways are rugged and poorly maintained, giving way to secluded enclaves, where lineages have taken root for centuries in the same constrained ravines, ensconced by mistrouted summits. In this remote expanse, the very notion of civilization feels alien. The arm of county jurisprudence seldom extends to these elevated terrains, and when it does, it frequently arrives too late. Within Mitchell County, located in the northeastern sector of North Carolina, lay a particular state that wayfarers deliberately omitted from their discourse. It perched atop a precipitous incline, enveloped by an impenetrable expanse of oak and pine forests, so dense that they eclipsed the sun's rays even at high noon. The rudimentary track leading to this isolated dwelling was treacherous, strewn with loose rocks and gnarled roots, as if the very soil repudiated the existence of this place. Locals referred to the vicinity as Shadow Valley, although no official cartographic representation bore this ominous designation. It was merely a moniker murmured in hushed tones within village taverns and general stores, invariably accompanied by averted gazes and profound silences. The kin who inhabited this forsaken property were known as the Halloways. The precise chronology of their arrival remained shrouded in conjecture. Some oral traditions claimed they were already entrenched in the highlands predating American independence. Others solemnly swore they had migrated from the Virginian territories, reportedly fleeing some undisclosed transgression that none dared to broach. The family patriarch, a figure named Silas Halloway, was characterized as a man of imposing height, slender to the point of gauntness, possessing deeply set eyes that rarely seemed to blink, imparting an unnerving, perpetual stare. His spouse, Prudence, was an even more enigmatic presence. Her appearances beyond the confines of their estate were exceedingly rare. When she did materialize in the nearest settlement, the diminutive town of Little Bakersville, she invariably walked with her head bowed, her form swathed in dark shawls, even amidst the oppressive heat of summer. The Halloways maintained a modest farm, if such a rudimentary operation could truly be dignified with that appellation. A handful of emaciated chickens scratched in the dust. A poorly tended patch of vegetable garden yielded scant sustenance, and two sickly-looking goats roamed listlessly. There was a conspicuous absence of robust livestock, no discernible indicators of prosperity or thriving enterprise. Yet, they persevered. In some inexplicable manner, they consistently procured sufficient quantities of kerosene for illumination, flour for baking, and salt for preservation. This perplexing circumstance gave rise to the inaugural query that reverberated through the hamlets of the district. From whence did the Halloways acquire their pecuniary resources? Occasionally, wayfarers traversing that particular sector of North Carolina would vanish without a trace. Such occurrences were not entirely unprecedented. The mountainous terrain was inherently perilous, replete with concealed chasms, waterways that surged without forewarning, and a formidable array of untamed fauna bears, panthers, and wolves. Mortality was an ever-present specter in the Appalachian wilderness. However, a distinctive quality permeated the disappearances that transpired in the vicinity of Shadow Valley. Their frequency defied the realm of mere coincidence, occurring with an unsettling regularity that hinted at something far more sinister than random misfortune. In the year 1842, merchant of textiles named Benjamin Foster embarked on a journey from Asheville, bound for Tennessee. His conveyance laden with bolts of wool and cotton fabrics. He never reached his intended destination. His wagon was discovered weeks later, abandoned on a seldom-used secondary path. Less than 2 miles from the Halloway homestead, the valuable textiles had vanished. The draft animals were missing. Benjamin Foster was never sighted again, seemingly erased from existence. 2 years subsequently, in 1844, a recently wedded pair, Thomas and Martha Hendress, traversed the region en route to her ancestral dwelling in the Virginian mountains. They paused at an inn within Bakersville, partook of an evening meal, and secured lodgings for the night. However, the ensuing morning, they chose to depart before the first blush of dawn. The innkeeper observed their departure in the pre-dawn gloom, following the northerly trail. No one ever witnessed them thereafter. Weeks of exhaustive reconnaissance yielded not a single vestige. No discarded raiment, no skeletal remains, no indication of a temporary encampment, as if they had been utterly expunged from the fabric of reality. Numerous other cases compounded the mystery. An itinerant clergyman who preached his sermons from one settlement to the next vanished in 1846. A traveling vendor met a similar fate the subsequent year. A consistent thread bound all these inexplicable disappearances. Their trajectories invariably led through the same rugged, mountainous expanse, that precise strip of wilderness where the Halloway estate lay concealed amidst ancient arboreal giants. Yet, no one dared to openly accuse the family directly. There was a palpable dearth of irrefutable evidence. No eyewitnesses stepped forward, and in the North Carolina highlands of that period, unsubstantiated allegations could prove exceedingly perilous. Blood feuds were a prevalent and brutal reality. Entire family units could be annihilated by the propagation of mere rumors. Consequently, the populace favored silence. They opted to avert their gaze. They preferred to pursue their daily existence and fervently prayed they would never be compelled to traverse the tenebrous valley. The Halloways adhered to a peculiar, almost ritualistic routine. Silas would journey to Bakersville approximately once every 2 or 3 weeks. He invariably traveled alone and always under the cloak of twilight. His purchases were limited to the barest essentials, procured with worn silver coinage, and his communication never extended beyond what was absolutely indispensable. Ezra Whitmore, the proprietor of the local mercantile establishment, would subsequently characterize these infrequent visits as encounters with a still-breathing phantom. Silas never offered a smile, never posed a query, never exhibited any discernible emotion. He would meticulously gather his provisions, stow them within the battered canvas satchel he always carried, and then melt back into the mountains before the full onset of night. Prudence, his wife, presented an even greater enigma. Her appearance in town occurred perhaps once annually, always accompanied by Silas, and always in profound, unyielding silence. The women of the town would attempt to initiate conversation, inquiring about the rigors of life on the mountain, offering snippets of fabric or cherished culinary recipes. Yet, Prudence would merely offer a perfunctory nod, murmur barely audible expressions of gratitude, and then withdraw. Her complexion was unnervingly pallid, as if she had never been exposed to the sun's invigorating rays. Her eyes possessed a vitreous, distant quality, as though she were fixated upon some ethereal vista imperceptible to others. And then there were the other members of the familial unit. The precise numerical count of Halloways inhabiting the secluded property remained unknown. Some whispered of 3 generations coexisting, while others speculated wildly about 5 or even 6. However, they were never observed collectively. They never all descended to the town en masse. It was invariably Silas, occasionally accompanied by Prudence. The remaining Halloways remained unseen, sequestered upon that shadowy knoll, shielded by the dense arboreal cover and the sheer remoteness of their location. The summer of 1849 heralded a severe and protracted drought for the region. Tributaries dwindled to trickles. Agricultural yields withered prematurely, and livestock perished from thirst on numerous farms. The specter of hunger began to haunt the most impoverished households, and it was during this very summer that a subtle, yet discernible, alteration in the Halloways' customary conduct began to manifest. Silas initiated more frequent journeys to the town. The volume of his purchases escalated. Greater quantities of flour, more salt, additional kerosene, as if they were either making elaborate preparations for some unforeseen event, or meticulously concealing an activity that necessitated a greater allocation of resources than was typically required. It was also in this sweltering summer that a youthful huntsman named Elijah Broom experienced an encounter that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of events. Elijah was diligently tracking a wounded deer on the verdant slopes situated above Shadow Valley when he discerned the faint murmur of human voices. Such an encounter was highly unusual at that elevated altitude. Driven by a potent mix of curiosity and innate caution, he approached stealthily, expertly concealing himself behind a prominent rocky outcropping. The scene that unfolded before him instantly froze him in place. 3 distinct figures stood in a diminutive clearing, adjacent to a formation of rocks that appeared to have been deliberately stacked rather than naturally occurring. 2 men and a single woman, all clad in somber, tattered garments. Their conversation was conducted in hushed tones, yet Elijah managed to apprehend fragments of their discourse. Words pertaining to the next one, discussions about awaiting the new moon, and emphatic statements about keeping it safer this time permeated the air. The men carried rudimentary implements, shovels, pickaxes, and bulky objects shrouded in canvas, which bore the unmistakable, disturbing contours of a human form. Elijah did not linger to witness further. He retreated with the same silent stealth with which he had approached, descending the mountain as rapidly as his legs would carry him without generating the slightest sound, before racing directly to the residence of the county sheriff. However, upon his breathless and terror-stricken arrival, he was informed that the sheriff had traveled eastward, engrossed in resolving a land boundary dispute in a different jurisdiction. The deputy left in charge, a callow and inexperienced young man named Clayton Hayes, listened to Elijah's harrowing narrative with patent skepticism etched upon his features. Let us momentarily pause our descent into this chilling narrative. If you are engrossed in this unfolding investigation with us, we urge you to lend your support by subscribing to the Macabre Fear Zone channel, as a wealth of revelations still awaits concerning the Halloways and the grim secrets entombed within the North Carolina mountains. Additionally, please share your reflections in the comments section. Do you contend that the silence of a community can pose as significant a peril as the nefarious activities it inadvertently shields? Clayton Hayes was conspicuously ill-equipped to confront the formidable presence of the Halloways. He was merely 23 years of age, had held the position of deputy for less than half a year, and had dedicated the vast majority of that brief tenure to mediating tavern brawls and resolving petty squabbles over dilapidated fences. The very notion of embarking upon an investigation of a family dwelling in such profound mountain isolation, based solely upon the fragmented and agitated testimony of a terrified huntsman, struck him as excessively hazardous. Furthermore, an insidious undercurrent of dread permeated the atmosphere, that unspoken apprehension that infected every single conversation concerning the Halloways within Bakersville. Elijah Broom persisted relentlessly for several hours. He spent the entire afternoon within the confines of the modest police station, reiterating every granular detail of his sighting, swearing upon the Holy Bible that he was neither fabricating the account nor under the influence of intoxicants, and that he possessed an impeccable faculty for distinguishing between ordinary woodsmen and individuals clandestinely concealing something malevolent. Clayton eventually relented, but he imposed one stringent prerequisite. They would defer any action until the sheriff's return. They would abstain from any precipitate measures. They would absolutely not trespass upon the Halloway property without proper legal authorization and without sufficient complement of men to ensure their collective safety and security. Elijah departed that police station, burdened by a profound weight upon his conscience, a sensation that would not dissipate for the ensuing days. He was acutely aware that every passing hour of delay could signify a critical difference between unearthing tangible evidence and discovering only churned earth, meticulously erased tracks, and secrets reinterred even more profoundly. He retreated to his humble cabin on the periphery of Bakersville and endeavored to resume his customary hunting regimen. But restorative slumber eluded him. Every night, the spectral vision of those three shadowy figures, that tarp-shrouded mass, those implements sullied with freshly disturbed earth, replayed itself in an incessant loop, like a waking nightmare. Sheriff Edmund Garrett returned to the county 5 days subsequent to Elijah and Clayton's pivotal conversation. He was a man in his mid-50s, his hair streaked with distinguished gray, possessed a formidable reputation, not only for his unwavering commitment to justice, but also for his extreme prudence. He was not one to yield to impulsive actions or unsubstantiated rumors. His esteemed career had been painstakingly constructed upon a bedrock of meticulous investigations and thoroughly considered decisions. When Clayton relayed Elijah's compelling account, Edmund's brow furrowed in profound concentration, and he unequivocally demanded to engage directly with the huntsman before formulating any definitive judgments. The pivotal meeting transpired within the very police station on a sweltering August afternoon, when the oppressive heat rendered the air dense and difficult to inhale. Elijah recounted his harrowing narrative for the third time. This iteration was delivered to a man who listened with a distinctly different, more incisive, more calculated intensity. Edmund posed highly specific questions concerning every minutia. He inquired about the precise attire worn by the individuals, the exact classification of the implements they wielded, the specific direction of their ambulation, the duration for which Elijah had observed them, whether any horses or conveyances were discernible in the vicinity, and the precise linear distance to the recognized Halloway homestead. When Elijah concluded his exhaustive responses to the detailed cross-examination, Edmund remained in a prolonged, contemplative silence that appeared to stretch into an eternity. Then, with resolute gravity, he articulated his decision. They would ascend to that designated location the following day at first light. Leading a contingent of 6 men, in addition to himself, the intelligence disseminated through Bakersville with the rapidity of a raging inferno. The ensuing reactions were manifold and highly revealing. A segment of the citizenry expressed profound relief that a figure of authority would finally undertake an investigation into the enigmatic Halloways. Others voiced deep-seated apprehension, conversing in hushed tones about retributive acts and dire repercussions. And a final faction exhibited unadulterated terror, the kind of primal, ancestral dread that emanates from ancient lore transmitted across generations. An elderly agriculturalist named Josiah Crane sought out Edmund that very evening and earnestly cautioned him against disturbing matters that, in his wisdom, ought to remain undisturbed. He recounted tales of the Halloway lineage having resided within those mountains for a span exceeding any documented history, of their intimate comprehension of the region in ways no outsider could ever aspire to, of men who had ascended those treacherous slopes only to never return. Edmund expressed his gratitude for the admonition, but steadfastly adhered to his predetermined course of action. The subsequent morning, when the sun was still merely a nascent promise on the eastern horizon, 7 men convened before the police station. Edmund Garrett assumed leadership of the expedition. Clayton Hayes accompanied him in his capacity as deputy. Elijah Broom would function as the indispensable guide. The remaining 4 were judiciously selected volunteers, 2 fraternal farmers named Jacob and Samuel Winters, both possessing prior military experience within state militias, a burly blacksmith named Otto Kemper, renowned for his immense physical prowess and unwavering courage, and an exceptionally skilled tracker known solely as Tobias, a man of few utterances who had dedicated decades to hunting deep within the Appalachian wilderness. The arduous ascent commenced while a thick mantle of mist still enshrouded the valleys below. They followed the primary thoroughfare until it diverged, then elected the less frequented path that meandered towards the Shadow Valley. The vegetative cover grew progressively denser with each passing kilometer. Sunlight penetrated with increasing difficulty through the intricately interwoven canopies of ancient trees. The air was redolent with the scent of venerable dampness, of arboreal detritus decomposing for decades, of localities that the veneer of civilization had never genuinely permeated. No one uttered a single word during the arduous trek. Only the rhythmic cadence of boots upon loose earth and the occasional distant avian cry punctuated the oppressive silence. It required nearly 3 hours of strenuous hiking to attain the clearing Elijah had described in his initial accounts. When they finally emerged into the small, open expanse encircled by ancient trees, the huntsman gestured towards the peculiar lithic formation. It was precisely at that spot, proximate to the stones that appeared to have been deliberately stacked by human hands, that he had borne witness to the scene that had incessantly haunted him ever since. Tobias, the seasoned tracker, immediately advanced. His movements were precise and economical, the product of countless years spent interpreting the subtle omens embedded within the natural world. He knelt upon the moist ground, meticulously scrutinizing the earth with sensitive fingers, discerning barely perceptible indentations, patterns of footprints partially effaced by the relentless march of time and the cleansing touch of rainfall. When he finally stood erect, a grave expression was etched upon his countenance. He nodded decisively to Edmund and confirmed their most dire suspicions. Clearly disturbed earth, recent soil upheaval, telltale impressions indicating the presence of multiple individuals, and unequivocal signs of a weighty object having been either dragged or carried across the terrain. Edmund felt an involuntary tightening in his abdomen at this unequivocal corroboration. He issued an immediate directive for the group to initiate a systematic reconnaissance of the area, but emphatically stressed the imperative for extreme circumspection. They could not inadvertently compromise potential evidentiary material through heedless actions. The men fanned out across the clearing in a well-ordered formation, methodically examining the ground, the encircling arboreal cover, and every conceivable indication of recent human enterprise. Samuel Winters, one of the farming siblings, stumbled upon the initial disquieting discovery, a fragment of faded blue fabric ensnared within a thorny thicket. The material was violently rent and besmirched with something dark, which might have been ancient mud or coagulated blood, transmuted into a hardened brown crust. The texture and design of the cloth unequivocally suggested feminine apparel, decidedly not the coarse raiment typically worn by agricultural laborers. Clayton unearthed the second clue mere minutes later: fragments of hempen cordage, still tightly affixed to the trunk of a low-hanging tree, as if someone had ensnared an object or an individual there, and then expeditiously severed it to expunge the evidence. The rope exhibited unmistakable signs of having endured extreme tension, frayed fibers intimating a violent struggle or desperate resistance. And then Otto Kemper, meticulously excavating with his bare hands near the piled stones, uncovered something that compelled all the men to rush towards him with taut, apprehensive expressions. It was a metallic button, intricately engraved with a delicate, elaborate floral motif, the kind of button that adorned exquisite women's dresses, decidedly not the utilitarian garments of mountain women. Otto continued his excavation with even greater precision and unearthed 3 additional identical buttons, all interred merely inches deep, scattered over a constricted area, as if they had been violently torn from a garment during a desperate, prolonged struggle. Edmund carefully retrieved the buttons and scrutinized them in the filtered, crowing-ish illumination permeating through the dense arboreal canopy. His facial muscles progressively tightened as he twirled the small metal artifacts between his fingers. He was intimately familiar with this particular style of ornate button. He had observed similar fastenings on dresses vended by itinerant peddlers who regularly traversed the region. And then, a profoundly specific memory surged forth with agonizing clarity. Martha Hendress, the young newlywed who had vanished 5 years prior with her husband, Thomas, had been attired in a dress featuring such ornate buttons when she was last seen alive. Her grieving mother had reiterated this specific detail during the weeks of fruitless searching, repeatedly imploring anyone who would listen to search for a blue dress with flowery metal buttons. Edmund issued an immediate directive for them to delve deeper into that precise spot. His voice was taut, fused with a potent blend of unwavering determination and profound dread concerning what they might unearth. The men complied in strained silence. They employed sturdy twigs in their bare hands to painstakingly remove successive strata of earth, loose stones, and compacted leaves accumulated over years. The tension pervading the atmosphere became almost tangible. Each excavated handful of earth presented the harrowing possibility of a horrific discovery that would unequivocally corroborate their most dire reminiscences about the site. Yet, the more assiduously they dug, the less they discovered. Merely soil, unremarkable earth, mundane rocks, ancient arboreal root systems, no corporeal remains, no human skeletal fragments, no definitive evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny before a judge. After 2 hours of meticulous excavation that left all the men soiled and utterly exhausted, Edmund called a halt to their efforts. Frustration was visibly etched upon his sweat-streaked countenance. Nothing was interred in that specific location. Either it had never been there in the first instance, or it had been painstakingly removed prior to their arrival. The self-evident question hung heavy in the air, requiring no verbal articulation. If something had been interred there and subsequently removed, to where had it been relocated? And the answer seemed undeniably manifest. Wherever the Halloways deemed it safest, most probably within the very confines of their own property. A domain where no stranger would dare to trespass without an overwhelmingly compelling justification. Edmund made a momentous decision, one that would irrevocably alter the course of events. He announced their immediate intention to proceed to the Halloway estate. A profound, uncomfortable silence descended upon the group. Exploring a neglected clearing in the woods was one matter entirely. Trespassing upon the private property of a family, even one shrouded in the darkest suspicions, was an entirely different proposition. It demanded more than mere physical courage. It necessitated a robust foundation of legal authority, and every man present was acutely aware that Edmund was treading upon legally precarious ground. He possessed no formal warrant. He lacked any concrete evidentiary material that would unequivocally justify a trespass in the eyes of the law. He had only a handful of buttons, a fragment of torn fabric, a length of severed rope, and the testimony of a huntsman concerning something he had observed from a considerable distance. However, Edmund also bore the crushing weight of years of unexplained disappearances, years of unanswered inquiries, years of entire families being irrevocably shattered by the loss of loved ones who had simply vanished after passing in the vicinity of that accursed stretch of mountain. The cumulative pressure of so many unresolved cases, of so much unaddressed suffering, appeared to finally reach a definitive breaking point. Edmund concluded that this entire dark history, in conjunction with the circumstantial evidence they had just unearthed, was sufficient to justify, at the very least, a formal visit to the Halloway family. The descent to the property consumed less than an hour, yet it felt immeasurably longer. The path was perilously steep and exceedingly treacherous, with loose scree shifting precariously beneath their feet and exposed roots ready to ensnare the unwary. Tobias, through his intimate knowledge of the mountainous terrain, expertly navigated the route. When they finally emerged from the dense forest and beheld the dwelling for the inaugural time, They all instinctively halted, simply observing in profound silence. The Halloway house was a timber structure, darkened by the relentless passage of time and the pervasive dampness of its environment. Its roof, composed of uneven planks, was cloaked in thick layers of verdant and ochre moss. The edifice stood 2 stories tall, yet it seemed to incline subtly to one side, as if slowly yielding and sagging under the oppressive burden of its own immense weight and extreme antiquity. There were no cultivated flora, no painted or meticulously maintained fences. None of the customary indicators of diligent upkeep and familial pride that characterized even the most impoverished homesteads in the area. Only that somber, forbidding house, a small, partially collapsed barn adjacent to it, and that oppressive, undeniable sensation that something was profoundly, fundamentally amiss with the entire locale. A slender plume of gray smoke ascended from the stone chimney, slowly winding its way towards the partially overcast sky. The presence of smoke unequivocally indicated active human habitation within the dwelling. Edmund inhaled several deep, fortifying breaths, endeavoring to regulate his own escalating nervousness. He raised his hand in a gesture for the others to follow and commenced his measured advance towards the main entrance. His footsteps resonated with extraordinary loudness in the absolute, unnatural silence that pervaded the place. Even the birds seemed deliberately to abstain from song there, as if nature itself recognized something profoundly wrong and inherently perilous about the property. When Edmund was but a few feet from the front portal, it slowly creaked open with a sharp, grating sound of rusted hinges. The figure that materialized in the doorway was precisely as described. Silas Halloway, tall and exceedingly thin, almost skeletal, with those deeply set, tenebrous eyes that appeared never to blink, observing them without any discernible emotion. His expression betrayed no surprise at the unexpected visitation of 7 armed men. There was no visible apprehension etched upon his pale, angular countenance, only a peculiar, disquieting serenity, as if he had been anticipating this very moment, or perhaps simply held no regard for the ramifications of any accusation. Edmund formally introduced himself as the Sheriff of Mitchell County and unequivocally declared his intention to interrogate the family concerning the disappearances of travelers in the vicinity and about the recently unearthed evidentiary material nearby. Silas maintained his silence for several protracted seconds, his gaze slowly traversing each of the 7 men, as if meticulously committing every visage, every detail, every potential threat to memory. Then, in a guttural voice that sounded like coarse gravel being dragged over stone, he murmured that the mountains were inherently perilous, that individuals frequently became disoriented, that this was hardly a novel occurrence for anyone intimately familiar with the region. Edmund retorted with escalating firmness that he was not referring to individuals merely becoming lost in the wilderness. He was actively investigating systematic disappearances, conspicuously concentrated within a specific geographical area proximate to that particular property, and that he had uncovered compelling evidence of exceedingly suspicious activities. He declared his unwavering resolve to unearth the unvarnished truth about the fate of those missing individuals. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in Silas Halloway's expression. It was not the kind of fear Edmund had anticipated observing in an innocent man being unjustly accused. It was neither guilt nor apprehension. It was something akin to a dark amusement, as if he found the entire predicament vaguely comical or ironic. A minuscule, almost imperceptible smile briefly touched the corner of his thin mouth. Then he uttered a remark that sounded simultaneously like a veiled warning and an unsettling invitation. He mused that the truth was a concept most men were rarely genuinely prepared for, especially within these ancient mountains that had harbored secrets since before living memory. But if the sheriff truly insisted upon his quest for answers, he was welcome to enter. The family would be available to address his inquiries. With these profoundly disquieting utterances, Silas Halloway flung open the heavy door, feeling the dense, pervasive gloom and oppressive dampness of the house's interior. The effluvium emanating from within was peculiar, noxious melange of mildew, wood smoke, something decaying, and another indefinable odor that neither man could precisely identify, but which instinctively provoked a violent churning in their stomachs. Silas gestured invitingly with his pallid, bony hand, much like a host extending a cordial welcome to anticipated guests for an evening repast. Edmund cast a quick glance back at the 6 men accompanying him. He observed patent fear in the eyes of some, taut determination in others, and a bewildering admixture of both in the majority. Then, summoning a profound reservoir of courage from deep within his being, he inhaled one final deep breath of the external air and stepped across the shadowy threshold, finally entering the abode of the most twisted and disturbing family the isolated mountains of North Carolina had ever concealed from the eyes of the civilized world. The interior of the Halloway house surpassed its exterior in its unsettling ambience. Darkness permeated every recess, despite the brightness of midday outside. The windows were cloaked with thick, opaque draperies that effectively blocked almost all natural light. Only a scattering of candles throughout the rooms provided a dim, flickering illumination, casting restless, dancing shadows upon the stained wooden walls. The noxious odor intensified with every step taken inside. That nauseating amalgam of mold, ancient, pervasive smoke, and that indefinable something else Edmund could not quite pinpoint yet, which caused his primal instincts to scream for immediate egress. The primary communal room was Spartan and desolate. A few decrepit, worn pieces of furniture irregularly filled the expanse. A long, dark wooden table dominated the central area, encircled by mismatched chairs that appeared to have been salvaged from diverse sources over many decades. The walls were virtually barren, devoid of the family portraits, decorative embellishments, or personal artifacts that typically adorned homes of that era. Only patches of dampness and a few peculiar marks, which might have been scratches or remnants of old burns, marred their surfaces. The floorboards groaned loudly under the men's boots, producing disconcerting echoes throughout the dwelling. Silas closed the door behind the group, severing their last visual connection to the outside world. The resounding thud of the door closing possessed a final, definitive quality, prompting several of the men to instinctively place their hands near their holstered weapons. Edmund maintained his resolute posture, yet he could feel beads of perspiration trickling down his spine despite the comparatively cool temperature within the house. Other family members began to materialize from the shadows, like specters taking form. A woman, unmistakably Prudence Halloway, emerged from a side passageway. Her appearance precisely matched the descriptions: exceedingly pallid, almost translucent skin, vitreous, distant eyes, and slow, deliberate movements. She wore a simple, unadorned black dress that appeared not to have been laundered in weeks. Her hair was sloppily secured, with numerous gray strands escaping in every direction. She meticulously avoided direct eye contact with any of the visitors, keeping her gaze fixed upon some indeterminate point on the floor. Behind her came others, a younger man, perhaps 30 years of age, who shared the same sunken eyes and sickly emaciation as Silas. His movements were jerky, nervous, like a wild creature ensnared in a cage. An older woman, possibly in her 60s, was hunched over, her hands gnarled and distorted by severe arthritis. She breathed with audible difficulty, producing harsh, wet sounds. And then, 2 more men, brothers it seemed, both bearing the same vacant, expressing expression that characterized the entire family. Edmund silently counted. 6 members of the Halloway family were now visible, all assembled in that shadowy room, all observing the visitors with a curious blend of cold inquisitiveness and something that bordered on chilling anticipation. The sheriff commenced his interrogation with direct inquiries concerning the disappearances. He recited specific names: Benjamin Foster, the draper; Thomas and Martha Henders, the recently married couple, the itinerant preacher, the traveling salesman. He asked if any member of the family had encountered or interacted with these individuals in the respective years of their vanishing. The responses were uniformly similar and frustratingly vague. Silas, for the most part, spoke on behalf of his family, his voice retaining that characteristic gravelly timbre. They rarely encountered strangers. They lived in chosen isolation. They maintained no records of who traversed the distant pathways. The mountains were immense and perilous, replete with concealed precipices, untamed creatures, and unpredictable meteorological phenomena. People regularly perished in these mountains. This, Silas asserted, was simply the undeniable reality of existence in the Appalachians. Edmund then introduced the subject of the evidence unearthed in the clearing: the buttons, the torn fabric, the severed rope, the freshly disturbed earth. He directly inquired if any member of the family possessed an explanation for these discoveries made less than 2 miles from their property. The ensuing silence was thick and protracted. The family members exchanged brief, knowing glances, a silent communication that Edmund could not decipher, but which unequivocally held profound meaning for them. It was Prudence who finally broke the silence. Her voice was surprisingly high-pitched, almost childlike, utterly incongruous with her aged appearance. She murmured that they occasionally interred deceased animals far from the homestead to deter predatory creatures: chickens that succumbed to disease, a goat that fractured its leg and necessitated euthanasia. Perhaps, she ventured, the sheriff had stumbled upon one of these animal burial sites. As for the human accoutrements, well, lost travelers sometimes abandon belongings when fleeing danger. Bears, for instance, or panthers. There were, she concluded, a plethora of rational explanations that did not necessitate horrific accusations against blameless individuals. The explanation, on the surface, appeared plausible, yet something about it resonated falsely. Edmund had dedicated decades to law enforcement, interviewing countless individuals, and had cultivated a keen, almost unerring instinct for detecting mendacity. This family was undeniably concealing something. Every word was meticulously chosen, every response meticulously calculated. There was none of the natural apprehension one would expect from innocent individuals being unjustly accused. Only that disconcerting, artificial composure. Edmund requested permission to conduct a thorough inspection of the property. He wished to examine the barn, any ancillary storage structures, and the land surrounding the dwelling. Silas hesitated for the first time since the group's arrival. His eyes narrowed slightly, and that faint smile entirely vanished from his face. He asserted that this was private property, that the sheriff lacked a proper search warrant, and that there were explicit legal limitations to what the law permitted, even in investigative scenarios. His words revealed a surprising familiarity with legal procedures for someone who had ostensibly lived in isolation within the mountains for decades. The tension within the room escalated dramatically. The men accompanying Edmunds subtly adjusted their stances, instinctively bracing themselves for a potential confrontation. The Halloway family members, too, subtly shifted their postures, becoming more rigid, more vigilant. Edmund recognized he had reached a critical juncture. He genuinely lacked the formal legal authority to conduct a comprehensive search without a legitimate warrant. Yet, he also knew with absolute certainty, deep within his being, that if he departed the house now without uncovering further information, any existing evidence would be meticulously expunged before he could return with the requisite documentation. It was at this precise moment that Otto Kemper, the burly blacksmith who had remained silent until then, noticed something significant. His gaze had fixated upon a closed door situated at the rear of the room. Door that presumably led to the cellar or some form of subterranean storeroom. The door was secured by several heavy locks on its exterior, locks that appeared excessively robust for merely storing provisions or tools. And there was something else, fresh scratch marks etched into the lower portion of the door. as if something or someone had desperately attempted to force their way out from the inside. Otto discreetly captured Edmund's attention with a quick glance and a subtle nod. The sheriff followed the indicated direction and immediately comprehended the implications. This door was distinct. This door harbored profound secrets. He directly inquired what lay beyond it. Silas responded swiftly, perhaps too swiftly, that it was merely a mundane storage cellar where they kept preserved foodstuffs for the winter. Nothing of the slightest interest to investigators. Edmund took a step towards the door. Silas immediately obstructed his path, physically positioning himself between the sheriff and the cellar entrance. His expression had undergone a complete transformation. The artificial comment dissipated, replaced by something far darker, more menacing. The other family members also moved, forming a defensive cordon between the visitors and that particular door. The message was unequivocally clear. They would not permit access to that confined space. Clayton Hayes, sensing the situation rapidly escalating towards a dangerous precipice, suggested that perhaps they ought to withdraw to the town, procure the proper legal documentation, and return with additional men and adequate legal authority. Jacob and Samuel Winters, the farming siblings, concurred with tense nods. They were numerically equivalent to the Halloway family members, but within the confines of their own dwelling. In territory the Halloways knew intimately, if a violent confrontation were to erupt, the outcome would be uncertain and likely bloody. Edmund was torn between his unwavering duty as a representative of the law and his gut instincts, which screamed that something unspeakably horrific lurked behind that securely locked door. He knew that, technically, he ought to retreat, adhere to proper procedures, and return with a warrant and reinforcements. But he also knew with an absolute internal certainty that if he departed now, he would never truly uncover the truth. The Halloways would have days, perhaps weeks, to conceal, destroy, or relocate any incriminating evidence. It was in this moment of profound indecision that something entirely unexpected transpired. A sound emanated from behind the locked door. A muffled, distant sound, yet unmistakably human. It was not the creaking of aged wood or the groaning of boards expanding and contracting with temperature fluctuations. It was a monologue, protracted, desperate, the agonizing sound of someone in excruciating pain attempting to communicate through layers of timber and earth. Every single person in the room heard it. The sound persisted for only a few fleeting seconds before it abruptly ceased, as if someone or something had silenced its source. But those few seconds were sufficient to irrevocably alter the entire dynamic of the situation. Edmund no longer required a warrant. He now possessed unequivocal probable cause, direct evidence that an individual, possibly in grave danger, was confined behind that door. The law permitted immediate action in such extraordinary circumstances. The sheriff announced his resolute intention to open the door. Silas categorically refused, his voice now elevated and aggressively hostile. The other family members advanced menacingly, their hands moving towards rudimentary farm implements, strategically positioned around the room tools that could readily be transformed into lethal weapons. The situation was mere seconds away from erupting into outright violence. Edmund and his men drew their firearms. The chilling sound of hammers being cocked echoed through the shadowy room like distant thunder. The Halloway family froze in their defensive postures. They possessed no visible firearms, only knives, axes, and other agricultural tools. In a direct confrontation involving gunfire, they would be swiftly vanquished. However, that did not imply they would not fight. Their faces exhibited a fanatical determination. It's a kind of unwavering conviction that emanates from individuals who believe they are safeguarding something more vital than their own lives. Edmund issued a clear, unyielding ultimatum. Either the family voluntarily opened that door and permitted a full inspection of the basement, or he would force it open, and every individual inside would be apprehended for obstruction of justice and suspicion of grave felonies. The ensuing silence was charged with an almost electric tension. Seconds seemed to stretch into eternities as Silas Halloway meticulously calculated his limited options, his face contorted with conflicting expressions. Finally, with palpable reluctance and deliberately slow movements, Silas stepped away from the door, but not before delivering a cryptic and terrifying pronouncement. He averred that the sheriff was utterly unprepared for the horrors he would discover below, that some secrets existed for valid reasons, that the mountains possessed their own unique laws more ancient and profound than anything inscribed in legal texts, and that opening that door would unleash consequences Edmund could neither foresee nor control. The words sounded less like a direct threat and more like a genuine, albeit chilling, warning, which rendered them all the more profoundly disturbing. Edmund disregarded his pronouncements and approached the locked door. Otto Kemper accompanied him, prepared to force entry if necessary. Clayton and the other men kept their firearms trained upon the Halloway family, ensuring no hostile movements would be made. While the sheriff meticulously inspected, Edmund commenced removing the heavy locks one by one. There were 3 in total, each robust enough to secure a prison door. The metal was corroded with rust, but remained fully functional, emitting creaking sounds as it was manipulated. When the final lock was released, Edmund inhaled a deep breath, placed his hand upon the cold doorknob, and began to pull open the heavy door. The stench that immediately emanated was overwhelmingly powerful. It was not merely the odor of mold or subterranean dampness. It was something organic, decaying, mingled with human excrement, vomit, and other effluvia that violently churned their stomachs. Several of the men instinctively recoiled, covering their noses and mouths with their hands or scraps of cloth. Edmund compelled himself to stand firm, though his eyes watered from the sheer intensity of the putrid odor. A rudimentary wooden staircase descended into the absolute inky blackness of the basement. Edmund seized one of the candles from the room and began carefully negotiating the uneven, worn steps. Otto followed closely behind, and Clayton followed in close proximity. The others remained above, diligently maintaining surveillance over the family, who now watched with inscrutable expressions, complex amalgam of fear, anger, and something that bordered on fatalistic resignation. The cellar was considerably larger than Edmund had initially anticipated. It was not merely a diminutive pantry for storing potatoes and preserved goods. It was a vast, sprawling, subterranean space, excavated into the earth, with a low ceiling supported by irregular beams and walls composed of compacted earth and raw stone. The flickering candlelight gradually illuminated disquieting details, each revelation more profoundly disturbing than the last. Heavy chains were affixed to the earthen walls in multiple locations, sturdy chains with iron rings that clearly served no legitimate agricultural purpose. The dirt floor was darkly stained in numerous places, stains that bore the unmistakable appearance of ancient, congealed blood absorbed into the soil. And various objects were scattered throughout the space: tattered garments, solitary shoes, open and empty travel bags, personal effects that had unequivocally belonged to multiple individuals over the preceding years. Edmund immediately recognized some of the items: a small Holy Bible with initialed engravings on its cover, Th. Thomas Hendris, a silver brooch that had been meticulously described in the missing persons report of a traveler named Rebecca Ashford in 1843, a pocket watch that had once belonged to Benjamin Foster, the draper, identifiable by the distinctive engraving on its reverse side. But what most profoundly shocked Edmund was his discovery in the farthest recess of the basement, partially concealed behind a haphazard pile of dilapidated boxes. There, chained to the wall, was a living human being, a woman. Though her precise age was difficult to ascertain due to her severely deteriorated health, she was semi-nude, covered only by filthy rags, her physique terrifyingly emaciated, almost skeletal. Her hair was matted and encrusted with grime. Her skin exhibited unequivocal signs of prolonged neglect in inhumane living conditions. When the candlelight illuminated her face, she emitted a faint squeak and recoiled, clearly unaccustomed to even the dimmest illumination. Her eyes required several seconds to adjust and focus upon the descending men, and when they finally did, a complex mixture of absolute terror and something that might have been desperate hope flickered within them. Edmund approached slowly, endeavoring not to further alarm her. He spoke in a soft, reassuring tone, identifying himself as the sheriff, assuring her that he was there to render aid, that she was now secure. The woman did not respond with coherent words. She merely produced inarticulate sounds, as if she had entirely forgotten the faculty of speech, or as if her trauma was so profoundly ingrained that verbal communication had become an impossibility. Otto began searching for an implement robust enough to sever the chains that bound her. He located a heavy tool among the scattered objects and commenced working diligently on the iron rings. The resonant clang of metal striking metal echoed through the basement, commingling with the silent sobs of the rescued woman. Clayton, still positioned on the stairs, shouted upstairs to report the momentous discovery. Immediate sounds of a struggle emanated from the room above. The Halloway family was attempting to flee. Realizing that all was irrevocably lost, Jacob and Samuel struggled to restrain them. Screams, the crashing sound of furniture being overturned, heavy footsteps pounding in multiple directions. Chaos had finally erupted within the gloomy Halloway home. Edmund knew they needed to vacate that basement swiftly, both to assist his men and to remove the traumatized woman from that horrific environment. Otto finally succeeded in fracturing one of the rings, partially liberating her. They carefully lifted her. She could barely stand, her legs atrophied from indeterminate confinement. They began ascending the stairs, carrying her between them to back into the still, dim light of the main room, where the Halloway's ultimate fate would be decided in the ensuing chaotic minutes. The pandemonium in the main room had coalesced into a scene of taut restraint by the time Edmund emerged from the basement, cradling the rescued woman. Jacob Winters had Silas Halloway pinned against the wall, Connor's arms twisted behind his back, even as he struggled with astonishing tenacity for someone so gaunt. Samuel, with his rifle leveled, held two of the younger Halloway men at bay, forcing them to kneel on the floor with their hands clasped behind their heads. Tobias, the taciturn tracker, had ingeniously secured Prudence's hands with a length of rope from his backpack, while the older woman merely wept uncontrollably in a corner, her arthritic hands trembling violently. The rescued woman felt alarmingly insubstantial in Edmund and Otto's arms. As the slightly brighter light of the main room touched her face, additional details became clearer and more profoundly disturbing. Her cheekbones protruded sharply beneath pallid-stretched skin. Her eyes, now partially accustomed to the subdued illumination, revealed dilated pupils and an expression of profound confusion, as if she could not fully process the unfolding events. Scars, both old and new, marred her visible arms and shoulders. Some appeared to be the result of accidental injuries, while others suggested something far more deliberate and sinister. Edmund carefully laid her on the floor, removing his own coat to cover her and offer a modicum of dignity. She shivered incessantly, even though the day was not particularly cold. The tremor seemed to emanate from deep within, a profound shock to both her physical and mental being. Clayton knelt beside her, attempting to offer her water from his canteen, but she instinctively recoiled from his approaching hand like a wounded animal, distrustful of any human touch. Silas Halloway finally ceased struggling against Jacob. His resistance abruptly vanished, replaced by the same unsettling calm he had exhibited earlier. He watched Edmund with those sunken eyes, which now gleamed with something akin to macabre satisfaction. Then he began to speak, not defensively or in denial, but almost as if offering an explanation he considered perfectly rational. He mused that the mountains had always provided for his family, ever since his ancestors had settled in that secluded valley generations before American independence. The Halloways had adhered to laws far older than those of courts and governments. Travelers who became disoriented on the trails were not truly lost, but rather destined to serve a higher purpose. The family required sustenance to survive, and the mountains, through those foolish enough to venture alone into the remote passes, yielded what was needed. The words flowed from his mouth with a disturbing ease, as if he were describing perfectly acceptable agricultural practices or hunting techniques. He recounted how they kept captured travelers in the cellar, utilizing them for forced labor on the estate when circumstances demanded, seizing their belongings and provisions to supplement the family's meager resources. Some endured 4 years in the subterranean confines. Others succumbed more swiftly to the inhumane conditions. When they no longer served any useful purpose, they were conveyed to remote mountain locations where their remains would never be discovered. Edmund felt a burgeoning nausea as he listened to this casual confession of decades of crimes. Silas displayed no remorse whatsoever. For him and his kin, this was simply their established mode of existence. The way their parents had lived, and the way their grandparents had lived before them. Conventional morality held no sway in those isolated mountains where the law rarely penetrated, and survival was the sole paramount rule. Prudence, her hands still bound, began muttering incomprehensible things, prayers spersed with words in a dialect none of those present recognized, possibly some archaic form of English or Scots, preserved through generations of isolation. Her glassy eyes fixated on nothing in particular, wandering about the ceiling as if perceiving something invisible to others. Her mental state appeared profoundly compromised, perhaps a consequence of decades spent inhabiting the distorted reality forged by her family. Edmund ordered all family members to be securely restrained. They needed to be transported back to Bakersville, where they would be formally arrested and processed. But before departing, he knew he needed to conduct a more exhaustive search of the property. If there was one living victim in the basement, there might be others, or, more likely, compelling evidence of how many people had passed through this place of horrors over the years, leaving Clayton and Samuel in charge of guarding the prisoners. Edmund took Otto, Jacob, and Tobias back to the basement for further investigation. This time, they brought more candles and an oil lantern they discovered in the kitchen. The brighter illumination revealed additional details that the single candle had left, cloaked in shadow during their first hasty descent. The basement was even more extensive than it had initially appeared. There were offshoot small tunnels excavated into the earth that led to other areas. One of these terminated in what appeared to be a second entrance, currently obstructed by rocks and earth, likely used to discreetly remove items without traversing the main house. Another tunnel led to a smaller chamber where they found more chains, more indelible stains on the floor, and more unequivocal evidence of prolonged human occupation in absolutely deplorable conditions. Tobias, with his finely honed tracker's eyes, noticed marks on the earthen wall scratches made with fingers, fingernails, or stones, forming discernible patterns. Some resembled attempts to tally days or weeks, lines grouped in sets of 5 or 7. Others were words or names desperately etched into the hard surface. Rebecca was one of the names they managed to decipher. Martha was scrawled in shaky letters elsewhere, and there were others, partially effaced or illegible, silent testimonies of individuals who had spent an indeterminate amount of time in that subterranean hell. In one of the farthest chambers, they found something that caused even Edmund, with all his extensive experience as a law enforcement officer, to feel a profound weakness in his knees. There was an organized pile of personal items, not scattered haphazardly like the rest of the basement's contents, but meticulously arranged like some macabre trophy collection or a grim record. Leather wallets containing identification documents, wedding rings, intricately inscribed pocket watches, brooches, and various pieces of jewelry. Bibles with family names inscribed on their front pages. Each item represented a person, a unique life, a family that never knew the true fate of their cherished loved one. Otto began to systematically count the items, endeavoring to estimate how many distinct victims were represented in this gruesome collection. He stopped when he reached 23 separate sets of personal belongings. 23 people, at a minimum. Over how many years, no one could say for certain. And this tally did not even account for those whose belongings might have been discarded, sold, or lost over time. Edmund knew they needed to meticulously document everything. Each individual object would constitute crucial evidence in the trial that was inevitably to follow. They began carefully collecting the items, wrapping them in cloths, or placing them into makeshift bags improvised from materials found around the house. The work was slow and emotionally draining. Every item they touched had once been carried by someone who believed they would safely reach their destination, never conceiving that their final hours or days would be spent chained in suffocating darkness. While they toiled in the basement, Clayton faced his own set of challenges above ground. The rescued woman had begun to produce more articulate sounds, though she had not yet formed recognizable words. She pointed repeatedly towards the front door, clearly desperate to escape the confines of the house. Clayton wished to accommodate her, but he was wary of moving her too soon before Edmund could determine the appropriate course of action. Her medical condition was precarious. She was dehydrated, severely malnourished, and possibly suffering from undiagnosed broken bones or other injuries that were not immediately apparent. Silas continued speaking, now directing his words towards Clayton. He recounted how they kept their victims alive for prolonged periods, feeding them just enough to prevent outright demise, utilizing them for tasks the aging family could no longer perform alone. He spoke of how some captives gradually succumbed to madness, forgetting their identities, their origins, transforming into something more akin to domesticated animals than human beings. His voice maintained that disturbingly casual tone, as if discussing livestock management. Clayton endeavored not to listen, focusing his attention on the rescued woman and maintaining a vigilant eye on the other Halloway family members. But the words penetrated nonetheless, painting an increasingly horrifying tableau of the Halloway's modus operandi. They were not merely swift killers. They were something far worse, something that prolonged their victims' suffering for months or even years, extracting utility from them before finally discarding them when they were no longer deemed useful. After nearly 2 hours in the basement, Edmund and his group finally re-emerged. They carried bags overflowing with evidence objects that represented destroyed lives. The sheriff was visibly shaken, his face pale and strained. He informed Clayton that they had discovered evidence pertaining to at least 23 different victims, possibly more. The sheer magnitude of the Halloway's crimes surpassed anything that had ever occurred in that particular region of North Carolina. Now they confronted the formidable practical challenge of transporting 6 prisoners and a severely debilitated victim back to Bakersville, traversing treacherous mountain trails. Edmund decided they required additional assistance. He dispatched Tobias, the swiftest and most intimately familiar with the trails, to hasten back to town and return with a wagon, more men, and the local physician. Tobias set off immediately, disappearing into the dense forest with the agility of someone who knew every tree and rock in those mountains. The ensuing hours of waiting were tense and profoundly uncomfortable. The Halloway family members remained restrained, some now silent, others still mumbling incomprehensibly. The rescued woman alternated between near unconsciousness and agitated moments, attempting to rise and flee, always gently restrained by Clayton, who feared she would inflict further injury upon herself in the attempt. Edmund utilized the waiting period to explore the remaining portions of the property above ground. The partially collapsed barn revealed more dilapidated farm tools, but nothing of particular investigative interest. However, behind the barn, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation, stood another, smaller structure, almost a primitive shelter constructed of irregular planks and stacked stones. Inside this crude shelter, Edmund discovered something that completed the gruesome picture. There were more personal effects there, but also torn and stained clothing that had clearly been stripped from victims. Some garments still bore signs of violence rips that suggested forced removal, dark stains that were unmistakably dried blood. The Halloways apparently retained these clothes, perhaps with the intention of eventually selling or utilizing them, or simply as a component of their macabre trophy collection. When Tobias finally returned, it was mid-afternoon. He brought with him 8 additional men from Bakersville, including the local physician, a man named Dr. Harrison Webb, who carried his black bag of instruments and medicines. They also secured a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses, though everyone knew it would be exceedingly difficult to maneuver the vehicle up some of the steeper sections of the trail. Dr. Webb immediately examined the rescued woman. His diagnosis was grim, yet not without hope. She was severely malnourished and dehydrated, exhibited signs of multiple old, poorly healed injuries, and clearly suffered from profound psychological trauma. But she was young, perhaps 25 or 30 years of age, and with proper care, she could eventually recover physically. Mental recovery, however, would be a much longer and more uncertain process. He administered water in small sips, wrapped her in blankets he had brought, and recommended exceptionally careful transport back to the town. The Halloway family members were bound with additional ropes and placed in the wagon under heavy guard. Some of the Bakersville men, who had arrived as reinforcements, glared at the prisoners with barely suppressed hatred. Rumors about the Halloways had circulated for decades, and now, witnessing their worst suspicions confirmed, provoked intensely visceral reactions. Edmund had to intervene more than once to prevent some of the more excitable men from assaulting the defenseless prisoners. The return journey consumed exhausting hours. The wagon had to be manually pushed and pulled in several sections where the trail became too steep or too narrow. The rescued woman traveled lying on a makeshift stretcher, carried by 4 men who took turns when fatigue became excessive. Edmund and his original men marched alongside, maintaining constant vigilance over the prisoners and the surrounding terrain, still half expecting something else to emerge from that accursed mountain. By the time they finally descended to where the trail widened and became more passable, the sun was already setting. The golden and reddish light of dusk painted the mountains with hues that seemed incongruously beautiful, considering the horrors that had been revealed that day. The exhausted group finally reached the outskirts of Bakersville when darkness had already fully descended upon the sky. With only the first stars beginning to appear overhead, news of their arrival had already spread. It seemed the entire populace of Bakersville had converged in the streets, holding lanterns and torches, eagerly awaiting the sight of the Halloways finally captured. The silence that fell over the crowd as the wagon carrying the prisoners passed was deep and heavy. Decades of fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions culminated in that poignant moment. Some people wept openly, contemplating family members or acquaintances who had vanished over the years. Others simply watched with somber expressions, processing the devastating confirmation that true evil had coexisted so closely for so long. Edmund escorted the prisoners directly to the small Bakersville jail. The 6 available cells were all occupied, with each member of the Halloway family isolated from the others. Guards were stationed in continuous shifts, not only to prevent escape, but also to protect the prisoners from possible vengeful attacks by enraged citizens. The rescued woman was taken to Dr. Webb's home, where he and his wife could provide proper care and began the long, arduous process of recovery. That night, Edmund Garrett sat alone in his office, surrounded by the bags of evidence collected from the Halloway estate. He knew the coming days and weeks would be consumed by legal proceedings, meticulous documentation of crimes, strenuous efforts to identify victims through recovered objects, and the heartbreaking task of notifying families who had waited years for news. The work would be immense and emotionally devastating, but in that moment, He permitted himself to simply sit in profound silence, processing everything he had witnessed and heard. The sheer magnitude of the evil the Halloways represented was difficult to fully comprehend. They were not impulsive killers or common criminals. They were something more systematic, more calculated, more deeply twisted. An entire family functioning as an organized operation of capture, confinement, and exploitation of human beings for decades, operating in the shadows of isolated mountains where the law rarely penetrated, and survival was the sole paramount rule. Prudence, her hands still bound, began muttering incomprehensible things. Fragments of prayers interspersed with words in a dialect none of those present recognized, possibly some archaic form of English or Scots, preserved through generations of isolation. Her glassy eyes, fixated on nothing in particular, wandering about the ceiling as if perceiving something invisible to others. Her mental state appeared profoundly compromised, perhaps a consequence of decades spent inhabiting the distorted reality forged by her family. Edmund ordered all family members to be securely restrained. They needed to be transported back to Bakersville, where they would be formally arrested and processed. But before departing, he knew he needed to conduct a more exhaustive search of the property. If there was one living victim in the basement, there might be others, or, more likely, compelling evidence of how many people had passed through this place of horrors over the years. Leaving Clayton and Samuel in charge of guarding the prisoners, Edmund took Otto, Jacob, and Tobias back to the basement for further investigation. This time, they brought more candles and an oil lantern they discovered in the kitchen. The brighter illumination revealed additional details that the single candle had left. Cloaked in shadow during their first hasty descent, the basement was even more extensive than it had initially appeared. There were offshoot small tunnels excavated into the earth that led to other areas. One of these terminated in what appeared to be a second entrance, currently obstructed by rocks and earth, likely used to discreetly remove items without traversing the main house. Another tunnel led to a smaller chamber where they found more chains, more indelible stains on the floor, and more unequivocal evidence of prolonged human occupation in absolutely deplorable conditions. Tobias, with his finely honed tracker's eyes, noticed marks on the earthen walls, scratches made with fingers, fingernails, or stones, forming discernible patterns. Some resembled attempts to tally days or weeks, lines grouped in sets of 5 or 7. Others were words or names desperately etched into the hard surface. Rebecca was one of the names they managed to decipher. Martha was scrawled in shaky letters elsewhere. And there were others, partially effaced or illegible, silent testimonies of individuals who had spent an indeterminate amount of time in that subterranean hell. In one of the farthest chambers, they found something that caused even Edmund, with all his extensive experience as a law enforcement officer, to feel a profound weakness in his knees. There was an organized pile of personal items, not scattered haphazardly like the rest of the basement's contents, but meticulously arranged like some macabre trophy collection or a grim record. Leather wallets containing identification documents, wedding rings, intricately inscribed pocket watches, brooches, and various pieces of jewelry. Bibles with family names inscribed on their front pages. Each item represented a person, a unique life, a family that never knew the true fate of their cherished loved one. Otto began to systematically count the items, endeavoring to estimate how many distinct victims were represented in this gruesome collection. He stopped when he reached 23 separate sets of personal belongings. 23 people, at a minimum. Over how many years, no one could say for certain. And this tally did not even account for those whose belongings might have been discarded, sold, or lost over time. Edmund knew they needed to meticulously document everything. Each individual object would constitute crucial evidence in the trial that was inevitably to follow. They began carefully collecting the items, wrapping them in cloths, or placing them into makeshift bags improvised from materials found around the house. The work was slow and emotionally draining. Every item they touched had once been carried by someone who believed they would safely reach their destination, never conceiving that their final hours or days would be spent chained in suffocating darkness. While they toiled in the basement, Clayton faced his own set of challenges above ground. The rescued woman had begun to produce more articulate sounds, though she had not yet formed recognizable words. She pointed repeatedly towards the front door, clearly desperate to escape the confines of the house. Clayton wished to accommodate her, but he was wary of moving her too soon before Edmund could determine the appropriate course of action. Her medical condition was precarious. She was dehydrated, severely malnourished, possibly suffering from undiagnosed broken bones or other injuries that were not immediately apparent. Silas continued speaking, now directing his words towards Clayton. He recounted how they kept their victims alive for prolonged periods, feeding them just enough to prevent outright demise, utilizing them for tasks the aging family could no longer perform alone. He spoke of how some captives gradually succumbed to madness, forgetting their identities, their origins, transforming into something more akin to domesticated animals than human beings. His voice maintained that disturbingly casual tone, as if discussing livestock management. Clayton endeavored not to listen, focusing his attention on the rescued woman and maintaining a vigilant eye on the other Halloway family members. But the words penetrated nonetheless, painting an increasingly horrifying tableau of the Halloway's modus operandi. They were not merely swift killers. There was something far worse, something that prolonged their victims' suffering for months or even years, extracting utility from them before finally discarding them when they were no longer deemed useful. After nearly 2 hours in the basement, Edmund and his group finally re-emerged. They carried bags overflowing with evidence objects that represented destroyed lives. The sheriff was visibly shaken, his face pale and strained. He informed Clayton that they had discovered evidence pertaining to at least 23 different victims, possibly more. The sheer magnitude of the Halloway's crimes surpassed anything that had ever occurred in that particular region of North Carolina. Now they confronted the formidable practical challenge of transporting 6 prisoners and a severely debilitated victim back to Bakersville, traversing treacherous mountain trails. Edmund decided they required additional assistance. He dispatched Tobias, the swiftest and most intimately familiar with the trails, hastened back to town and returned with a wagon, more men, and the local physician. Tobias set off immediately, disappearing into the dense forest with the agility of someone who knew every tree and rock in those mountains. The ensuing hours of waiting were tense and profoundly uncomfortable. The Halloway family members remained restrained, some now silent, others still mumbling incomprehensibly. The rescued woman alternated between near unconsciousness and agitated moments, attempting to rise and flee, always gently restrained by Clayton, who feared she would inflict further injury upon herself in the attempt. Edmund utilized the waiting period to explore the remaining portions of the property above ground. The partially collapsed barn revealed more dilapidated farm tools, but nothing of particular investigative interest. However, behind the barn, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation, stood another, smaller structure, almost a primitive shelter constructed of irregular planks and stacked stones. Inside this crude shelter, Edmund discovered something that completed the gruesome picture. There were more personal effects there, but also torn and stained clothing that had clearly been stripped from victims. Some garments still bore signs of violence rips that suggested forced removal, dark stains that were unmistakably dried blood. The Halloways apparently retained these clothes, perhaps with the intention of eventually selling or utilizing them, or simply as a component of their macabre trophy collection. When Tobias finally returned, it was mid-afternoon. He brought with him 8 additional men from Bakersville, including the local physician, a man named Dr. Harrison Webb, who carried his black bag of instruments and medicines. They also secured a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses, though everyone knew it would be exceedingly difficult to maneuver the vehicle up some of the steeper sections of the trail. Dr. Webb immediately examined the rescued woman. His diagnosis was grim, yet not without hope. She was severely malnourished and dehydrated, exhibited signs of multiple old, poorly healed injuries, and clearly suffered from profound psychological trauma. But she was young, perhaps 25 or 30 years of age, and with proper care, she could eventually recover physically. Mental recovery, however, would be a much longer and more uncertain process. He administered water in small sips, wrapped her in blankets he had brought, and recommended exceptionally careful transport back to the town. The Halloway family members were bound with additional ropes and placed in a wagon under heavy guard. Some of the Bakersville men, who had arrived as reinforcements, glared at the prisoners with barely suppressed hatred. Rumors about the Halloways had circulated for decades, and now, witnessing their worst suspicions confirmed, provoked intensely visceral reactions. Edmund had to intervene more than once to prevent some of the more excitable men from assaulting the defenseless prisoners. The return journey consumed exhausting hours. The wagon had to be manually pushed and pulled in several sections where the trail became too steep or too narrow. The rescued woman traveled lying on a makeshift stretcher, carried by 4 men who took turns when fatigue became excessive. Edmund and his original men marched alongside, maintaining constant vigilance over the prisoners in the surrounding terrain, still half expecting something else to emerge from that accursed mountain. By the time they finally descended to where the trail widened and became more passable, the sun was already setting. The golden and reddish light of dusk painted the mountains with hues that seemed congruously beautiful considering the horrors that had been revealed that day. The exhausted group finally reached the outskirts of Bakersville when darkness had already fully descended upon the sky, with only the first stars beginning to appear overhead. News of their arrival had already spread. It seemed the entire populace of Bakersville had converged in the streets, holding lanterns and torches, eagerly awaiting the sight of the Halloways finally captured. The silence that fell over the crowd as the wagon carrying the prisoners passed was deep and heavy. Decades of fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions culminated in that poignant moment. Some people wept openly, contemplating family members or acquaintances who had vanished over the years. Others simply watched with somber expressions, processing the devastating confirmation that true evil had coexisted so closely for so long. Edmund escorted the prisoners directly to the small Bakersville jail. The 6 available cells were all occupied, with each member of the Halloway family isolated from the others. Guards were stationed in continuous shifts, not only to prevent escape, but also to protect the prisoners from possible vengeful attacks by enraged citizens. The rescued woman was taken to Dr. Webb's home, where he and his wife could provide proper care and begin the long, arduous process of recovery. That night, Edmund Garrett sat alone in his office, surrounded by the bags of evidence collected from the Halloway estate. He knew the coming days and weeks would be consumed by legal proceedings, meticulous documentation of crimes, strenuous efforts to identify victims through recovered objects, and the heartbreaking task of notifying families who had waited years for news. The work would be immense and emotionally devastating. But in that moment, he permitted himself to simply sit in profound silence, processing everything he had witnessed and heard. The sheer magnitude of the evil the Halloways represented was difficult to fully comprehend. They were not impulsive killers or common criminals. There was something more systematic, more calculated, more deeply twisted. An entire family functioning as an organized operation of capture, confinement, and exploitation of human beings for decades, operating in the shadows of isolated mountains where the law rarely penetrated. Edmund wondered how many other families like the Halloways might exist in the vast expanses of the Appalachian wilderness, in remote valleys where no law enforcement officer had ever ventured, living by their own perverse rules, far from the watchful eyes of civilization. The thought was terrifying, and, disturbingly, probably true. The mountains harbored many secrets, and only a mere fraction of them would ever come to light. The ensuing days transformed Bakersville into a whirlwind of unprecedented activity. The small town, which typically operated at a tranquil, predictable cadence, now buzzed with journalists from Asheville and even from as far afield as Charlotte and Raleigh. News of the Halloway's apprehension and the discovery of their sinister activities had disseminated across the state with astonishing celerity. Telegraphs relayed fragmented accounts of the story to other regions, and soon, the entirety of North Carolina was abuzz with discussions about the mountain family that had lived in monstrous secrecy for generations. Edmund Garrett barely slept for the initial 72 hours subsequent to the rescue. His office was converted into the operational hub for an investigation that incrementally grew in complexity with each passing hour. The artifacts recovered from the Halloway basement were meticulously cataloged and systematically arranged on long tables. Each item was assigned a unique registration number, accompanied by a detailed description, and, whenever feasible, cross-referenced with missing person reports filed over the preceding years. The identification endeavor was agonizingly slow and profoundly painful. Edmund summoned families who had reported disappearances over the past 2 decades to come and scrutinize the recovered objects. The room designated for the display of evidence bore witness to repeated scenes of raw anguish. An elderly mother recognized her missing son's pocket watch from 1844 and collapsed into uncontrollable sobs. Finally receiving an answer after 5 years of torturous uncertainty, a man identified his sister's wedding ring, key sickly engraved with her initials and the wedding date, thereby confirming the horrific fate of a woman who had departed to visit relatives in Virginia and never reached her destination. With each successful identification, Edmund felt the crushing weight upon his shoulders intensify. Each object represented not merely a victim, but a systemic failure of the justice system to adequately safeguard vulnerable citizens. Disappearances had been reported, searches had been conducted, but no one had managed to connect the disparate dots. Summoned the requisite courage to directly confront the Halloways until that fateful summer of 1849. The rescued woman remained under the dedicated care of Dr. Webb, slowly recuperating her physical strength, but still unable to communicate coherently. She could now ingest water and consume light foodstuffs, and her involuntary tremors had noticeably diminished over time. However, whenever anyone attempted to pose questions regarding her identity or origins, she would merely gaze with those frightened eyes and cower into a defensive posture. The psychological trauma was too profoundly ingrained to be surmounted in a matter of days or even weeks. Edmund procured sketches and photographs of missing women, endeavoring to find a match for the survivor. It was a painstaking process of comparing physical attributes, distorted by suffering, with images of healthy individuals in their prior lives. Eventually, the doctor's wife, a compassionate woman named Margaret Webb, discerned a potential resemblance to a woman named Sarah Jennings, who had vanished 3 years earlier. Sarah Jennings was the daughter of an agriculturalist from an adjacent county. She was 24 years of age when she disappeared while en route to meet a friend. Her family had diligently searched for months without success. Edmund dispatched a message to Sarah's parents, requesting their presence in Bakersville when they could undertake the journey. The wait for definitive confirmation was agonizing for all parties involved. Meanwhile, the Halloway family members remained incarcerated, each in isolation from the others. Edmund interrogated them individually over the course of several days, meticulously attempting to construct a comprehensive picture of their operations. Silas maintained his demeanor of unsettling calm, responding to questions with stomach-churning detail. He described their methods for identifying vulnerable targets, lone travelers, or unaccompanied couples, individuals who would not be immediately sought if they disappeared. The family had established covert observation points along the primary trails, vantage points from which they could monitor passers-by with without being detected. When they spotted a potential victim, they followed discreetly, patiently, biding their time. Sometimes they extended what appeared to be genuine assistance, inviting lost or exhausted travelers to seek respite on their property. Other times, they employed more direct, brutal methods, ambushing them in secluded stretches of the trail where screams would be heard by no one. Once captured, the victims were transported to the basement. There, they were held in chains, fed minimally, and compelled to perform labor when necessary. The Halloways utilized forced labor to maintain their property, chop firewood, tend to the animals, and execute tasks requiring physical exertion. Those who resisted or proved troublesome were severely punished until they submitted or were no longer deemed useful. Prudence Halloway, when questioned, proved even more mentally disturbed than she had initially appeared. She alternated between moments of partial lucidity and periods where she seemed to exist in an entirely different reality. During her clearer moments, she spoke of ancestral family traditions passed down through generations, of how her forebears had lived this way in the Scottish mountains before their immigration to America. How high was simply the natural order of things, that the strong would survive at the expense of the weak. The children and other family members had less to contribute. Some claimed they were merely obeying Silas's directives, afraid to defy the patriarch. Others remained utterly silent, refusing to answer any questions. Edmund knew they were all culpable to varying degrees, complicit in decades of heinous crimes. The justice system would ultimately have to determine the fate of each individual. 3 days after her initial arrest, Sarah Jennings's parents arrived in Bakersville, accompanied by a younger brother. They were simple folk, agriculturalists who had visibly aged in the 3 years since their daughter's disappearance. Sarah's mother, Elizabeth Jennings, trembled visibly as Edmund guided her to Dr. Webb's residence. The sheriff prepared her for what she would witness, explaining that the rescued woman was in such poor physical condition and had suffered such severe psychological trauma that she might not immediately recognize them, even if it were indeed Sarah. When Elizabeth entered the room where the survivor lay resting, the silence was shattered by a choked sob. Despite the drastic alterations brought by 3 years of captivity and suffering, Elizabeth instantly recognized her daughter. The specific configuration of her ears, a small birthmark on her neck, the distinctive curvature of her fingers. It was Sarah. Her missing daughter was alive, profoundly wounded, but alive. Sarah did not initially react to her mother's presence. Her eyes traversed Elizabeth's face without apparent recognition, as if she were gazing at a stranger. But when Elizabeth began to softly hum a lullaby she used to sing when Sarah was a small child, something fundamental shifted. Sarah's pupils dilated, her body tensed, and then tears began to stream silently down her emaciated face. They were not solely tears of sadness, but of something far deeper, as if the song had resonated with a part of her psyche that had remained hidden and protected throughout her captivity. The reunion was bittersweet. Sarah was alive, but the person she had been before the abduction was profoundly altered, possibly irrevocably so. The ensuing months and years would demand immense patience from her family as they endeavored to assist her in rebuilding some semblance of a normal existence. But at least there was hope now, commodity that had been conspicuously absent during the 3 years of fruitless searching. The confirmation of Sarah's identity brought a measure of closure to the Jennings family, but it also intensified the anguish of other families whose loved ones had not been found alive. Edmund knew that the majority of the Halloway's victims had not been as fortunate as Sarah. Silas, in his interrogations, had vaguely alluded to locations in the mountains where they disposed of those who did not survive captivity or who no longer served the family's purposes. But he steadfastly refused to provide specific geographical coordinates, demonstrating ultimate cruelty by denying the families even the remote possibility of recovering remains for proper burial. Edmund organized search expeditions in the general areas Silas had mentioned. Groups of volunteers, including experienced hunters and trackers, ventured into remote regions of the mountains, tirelessly searching for evidence. The endeavor was arduous and frequently fruitless. The mountains were vast, the vegetation dense, and years of exposure to the elements made locating human remains exceedingly difficult. Some searches yielded fragments of clothing, bones that could be either human or animal, and small objects that possibly belonged to travelers, but definitive confirmation was rare. Meanwhile, preparations for the impending trials commenced. The district attorney, a formidable man named Nathaniel Pierce, arrived from Asheville to personally assume charge of the case. He was an imposing figure, renowned for his courtroom eloquence and his impressive conviction rate. He meticulously reviewed all the gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and consulted extensively with Edmund on every aspect of the investigation. Pierce recognized that this would be the most significant case of his career or trial that would command statewide attention and establish important legal precedents. The primary challenge was constructing specific cases when many of the victims would never be conclusively identified. Pierce resolved to focus on the cases where he possessed the strongest evidentiary foundation. Benjamin Foster, whose belongings had been found and whose abandoned wagon could be linked to the Halloways through testimony. Thomas and Martha Hendress, whose distinctive buttons and other personal items had been recovered. Sarah Jennings, who was alive and could potentially testify if her recovery progressed sufficiently. And several other cases where the combination of missing person reports and recovered objects created compelling arguments. Preliminary hearings commenced in late August. The Bakersville Courthouse, a modest wooden edifice that typically handled minor disputes, found itself utterly inadequate for the magnitude of this case. The courtroom was packed beyond its capacity every time the proceedings took place. People traveled from distant counties, some journeying for days, solely to witness the unfolding of this extraordinary case. Journalists filled the front benches, frantically scribbling down every word for their articles that would be disseminated in newspapers across North Carolina. Silas Halloway was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and murder. Prudence and the other family members faced similar charges, although Prosecutor Pierce indicated he would seek differential sentences based on each member's individual level of involvement. The judge assigned to the case, the Honorable Marcus Whitfield, was renowned for his unwavering integrity and impartiality. He stipulated that formal trials would begin in October, allowing ample time for adequate preparation on both sides. Finding defense attorneys willing to represent the Halloways proved an unexpected challenge. Public opinion was so vehemently against them that no local attorney desired to associate their professional reputation with the case. Eventually, 2 lawyers from Raleigh were appointed by the court, fulfilling their professional obligation to ensure that even the most reviled defendants received adequate legal representation. They arrived in Bakersville in early September and began the arduous task of constructing some form of defense for essentially defenseless clients. During this period of intense legal preparation, life in the town slowly attempted to revert to some semblance of normalcy, though everyone understood that Bakersville had been irrevocably transformed by the events of that summer. Conversations in taverns and general stores invariably circled back to the Halloways. People revisited old memories, recalling strange or suspicious moments that at the time had seemed insignificant, griefs, but now acquired new, sinister significance. Josiah Crane, the elderly farmer who had cautioned Edmund against disturbing matters that should have remained quiet, now expressed conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he felt profound relief that the Halloway threat had finally been eliminated. On the other, he and many other longtime residents carried a heavy burden of guilt for not having acted sooner, for having allowed fear and inaction to prevail while innocent people suffered and died just miles away. Edmund also grappled with his own internal demons. As county sheriff, he felt a profound personal responsibility for every victim. Who could have been saved if the investigation had commenced years earlier? He mentally revisited every missing person report filed during his tenure in office, scrutinizing for signs he should have noticed, connections he should have made. The weight of guilt was crushing in private, though publicly he maintained a professional and focused demeanor. Sarah Jennings made slow but remarkable progress under the dedicated care of her family and Dr. Webb. She began eating more regularly, gained a small amount of weight, and her tremors completely ceased. Most significantly, she began speaking again, initially in single words, then in simple sentences. Her first articulate words were to her mother, a hoarse whisper of Elizabeth's name. It was a moment of profound joy amidst so much pervasive sadness. But Sarah also suffered terrifying nightmares that awakened her screaming in the darkness. She could not tolerate being in small, enclosed spaces. She became extremely agitated whenever she heard the sounds of chains or scraping metal. The trauma was deeply ingrained in her psyche, and everyone understood that full recovery, if it were possible at all, would demand years of patient care and unwavering love. As September transitioned into October and the leaves began their magnificent transformation in the mountains, Bakersville braced itself for the trials that would determine not only the Halloway's fate, but also how the community would process and ultimately overcome the horror it had coexisted with for so long. The mountains encircling the town appeared different now, less picturesque and more forbidding, as constant reminders that natural beauty could conceal profound darkness. Edmund Garrett dedicated his nights that month to meticulously reviewing evidence, preparing testimony, and ensuring every detail was perfectly documented for the impending trials. He was resolutely determined to ensure that justice was served, not only for the identified victims, but for all those whose names would never be known, whose families would never find closure, and whose remains would remain lost in the vastness of the Appalachian Mountains. The Halloway story had transcended the confines of a simple criminal case. It had evolved into a cautionary tale about the perils of isolation, about how communities could fail to protect their most vulnerable members, about how evil could flourish when decent people chose to avert their gaze out of fear or convenience. It was a lesson that Bakersville, and indeed all of North Carolina, would carry with them for generations to come. The trials commenced in the second week of October 1849, when autumn was already painting the North Carolina mountains with intense hues of crimson, amber, and gold. The sheer beauty of the season stood in stark contrast to the somber nature of the proceedings about to begin. The Bakersville courthouse had been temporarily expanded with additional makeshift structures to accommodate the unprecedented crowds that flocked to attend. People from across the state undertook the arduous journey, some traveling for days, solely to bear witness to the unfolding of this extraordinary case. Judge Marcus Whitfield opened the proceedings with solemn remarks concerning the paramount importance of order and decorum, reminding everyone present that despite the deeply emotional nature of the case, justice must be administered calmly and strictly in accordance with the law. His voice was firm and commanded immediate respect. The packed galleries fell into a complete silence as he brought down his gavel, signaling the formal commencement of proceedings against Silas Halloway, the first of the defendants to stand trial. Prosecutor Nathaniel Pierce presented his case with methodical precision and carefully crafted eloquence. He brought forth witnesses who recounted disappearances spanning 2 decades, all of which had occurred within the same mountainous region in close proximity to the Halloway property. Edmund Garrett testified extensively about the investigation, the discovery of evidence in the clearing, and the harrowing rescue of Sarah Jennings from the basement. His voice trembled at specific junctures as he vividly described the inhumane conditions in which they found the young woman. Yet he maintained professional composure throughout his exhaustive testimony. The recovered artifacts were presented one by one, each accompanied by heart-wrenching testimonies from family members who identified them. A grieving mother recognized her missing daughter's silver brooch and wept openly before the entire courtroom. A brother confirmed that the intricately engraved pocket watch had belonged to his older sibling, who had departed for Tennessee and never arrived. Each identification meticulously formed a devastating mosaic of lives tragically interrupted, families irrevocably shattered, and futures cruelly stolen. Sarah Jennings was called to testify in the third week of the trial. Her physical appearance had improved considerably since her rescue, though she was still noticeably underweight, and her eyes retained that haunted quality characteristic of someone who had witnessed horrors no human being should ever behold. Her mother accompanied her to the witness stand, tenderly holding her hand until the last possible moment. Sarah's testimony was fragmented and difficult to articulate, but profoundly impactful. She described in a low, hesitant voice how she had been ambushed on the trail by members of the Halloway family, who had feigned an offer of assistance when her horse sustained a lameness. Trusting their apparent kindness, she had agreed to accompany them to their property to rest while the animal recovered. Once inside the house, everything irrevocably changed. She was overpowered, dragged to the basement, and chained in the damp, suffocating darkness. Sarah spoke of the subsequent 3 years in general terms, meticulously avoiding specific, agonizing details that were clearly too traumatic to verbalize. She alluded to the constant, gnawing hunger, the piercing cold of the basement during the harsh winters, the crushing loneliness interrupted only by occasional visits from family members who brought water and minimal sustenance. She described how she eventually lost all track of time, how days merged into weeks and weeks into months without any external marker to differentiate one from the other. Most devastatingly, she recounted hearing other faint voices occasionally emanating from adjacent chambers or connecting tunnels within the basement, voices that pleaded, cried, and eventually fell silent. She never actually saw these other individuals, but she knew with an agonizing certainty that she was not alone in that subterranean hell. And gradually, over the months, these voices disappeared one by one, leaving behind only a silence that was, in its own way, even more terrifying. The defense attorneys attempted to challenge the reliability of her testimony, suggesting that severe trauma might have distorted her memories or caused confusion regarding the actual events. However, Sarah remained unwavering in her assertions, and her evident sincerity was undeniable. When she finally descended from the witness stand, there was not a single person in the courtroom who remained untouched by her harrowing words. Silas's defense attorneys desperately attempted to argue that he was merely a product of his environment, of distorted family traditions transmitted through generations, of an isolation that had fostered a moral system completely disconnected from civilized society. They suggested that he should not be judged by the same ethical standards as someone who had grown up with a proper education and exposure to normal social values. It was a desperate and transparent strategy, and it clearly failed to resonate with a jury of 12 county men who fully comprehended the profound difference between the hardships of rural life and systematic, deliberate evil. Silas himself displayed scant emotion throughout the entire trial. He sat in the defendant's chair with the same unsettling calm he had exhibited from the very beginning, occasionally whispering something to his lawyers, but never once showing remorse or even apparent concern for the ultimate outcome. When he finally had the opportunity to speak in his own defense, he declined, merely shaking his head slowly and remaining silent. The jury's deliberations were surprisingly swift. After just 3 hours of intense discussion, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all charges, including kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and multiple counts of murder. Judge Whitfield accepted the verdict and scheduled sentencing for 2 days later, allowing ample time for the proper preparation of the necessary legal documents. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was even more densely packed than during the trial itself. Judge Whitfield delivered his remarks with a gravity appropriate to the heinous magnitude of the crimes. He characterized Silas Halloway's actions as representing the most depraved form of human wickedness, systematic and prolonged violation of everything civilized society held sacred. He cited the law's fundamental responsibility to protect the innocent and punish those who deliberately inflict suffering. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 60 days. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom when the words were pronounced, complex mixture of satisfaction at justice being served and a palpable discomfort at the absolute finality of capital punishment. Silas received the sentence with the same blank expression he had maintained throughout the entire proceedings, as if the judge's words held no more significance to him than the sound of wind rustling through the trees. The trials of the other Halloway family members continued in the subsequent weeks. Prudence was deemed mentally incompetent to stand full trial due to her severely deteriorating psychological state, but she was sentenced to life in a state asylum. Two of the younger men, demonstrably less involved in the family's overarching decisions, but still undeniably complicit, received lengthy prison sentences. The remaining members received varying sentences based on their individual levels of involvement and culpability. Silas Halloway's execution was scheduled for early December. In the days leading up to the appointed date, there was considerable public debate concerning whether it should be a public or private event. Traditionally, executions were communal events, serving as a stark demonstration of justice and a powerful deterrent to future crimes. However, Edmund Garrett passionately argued that this case had already inflicted enough pain upon Bakersville, and that transforming Silas's death into a public spectacle would only prolong the collective suffering. Judge Whitfield concurred, ruling that only official witnesses and designated representatives of the victims' families would be permitted to attend. The execution took place on a frigid December morning, the dense fog blanketing the mountains and the first frost of winter crystallizing on the trees. Silas ascended the purpose-built scaffold with the same measured, deliberate steps that had characterized his every movement. He declined any offer of final words, simply nodding to the executioner when he was prepared. Edmund was present as an official witness, feeling a profound obligation to see the case through to its final grim conclusion. When the trap sprang and Silas fell, the sound echoed through the silent morning like a definitive end to a dark, haunting chapter in North Carolina's history. There was no celebration, only a quiet, somber sense that justice, however imperfect and belated, had finally been served. The ensuing months brought a slow, agonizing process of healing to Bakersville. Sarah Jennings continued her arduous recovery, eventually able to assist her family on the farm with simple tasks. Though everyone understood she would never be completely the same person she had been before the kidnapping, her spirit, though scarred, began to mend. Other families commenced appropriate grieving processes for loved ones whose fates were finally confirmed, holding memorial services even in the absence of bodies to bury. Edmund Garrett remained sheriff, but the Halloway case fundamentally transformed him. He implemented new procedures for investigating missing persons, established improved communication protocols between neighboring counties to facilitate the sharing of information on potentially connected cases, and organized regular patrols on remote trails to increase law enforcement presence in previously neglected areas. He was unyieldingly determined to ensure that nothing akin to the Halloway situation could ever again transpire under his jurisdiction. The Halloway property was eventually razed by order of the county. No one wished for the structure to remain as a physical reminder of the horrors that had occurred there. One spring afternoon in 1850, a group of men ascended the mountain carrying torches and kerosene. The house and barn were set ablaze, the flames visible from Bakersville as a towering column of black smoke ascending against a cerulean sky. The basement was collapsed, meticulously filled with rocks and earth, and sealed forever. Vegetation eventually reclaimed that patch of land. Trees grew where the house had once stood. Bushes covered the burned foundations, and within a few years, little remained to indicate that humans had ever lived there. Only those intimately familiar with the history could identify the site, and most chose to avoid that particular area of the mountains anyway, as if the profound evil that had occurred there had permanently contaminated the very soil itself. Journalists and writers maintained a fervent interest in the case for many years. Articles appeared in newspapers across the country, some factual, others sensationally embellished beyond recognition. Books were eventually authored, some attempting to analyze the twisted psychology of the Halloway family, others focusing on the intricate investigative aspects of the case. The Halloway name became synonymous in North Carolina with hidden evil. A chilling word whispered as parents cautioned with their children about the dangers of trusting strangers or traveling alone in remote locales. For Edmund Garrett, the case never truly concluded. Until his final days as sheriff, he meticulously kept the Halloway victims' unclaimed belongings in his office, perpetually hoping that eventually someone would come forward to identify them. Occasionally, decades later, someone would appear, a grandniece searching for an aunt who had disappeared before she was born, a grandson diligently investigating family history. And Edmund welcomed these individuals with unwavering patience and compassion, providing them with the answers they sought. Even when those answers only confirmed ancient, heartbreaking tragedies, the North Carolina mountains continued to guard their secrets, vast and indifferent to the human drama unfolding in their valleys and slopes. But the Halloway story remained a permanent, chilling reminder that natural beauty can conceal profound darkness, that isolation can permit evil to flourish far from watchful eyes, and that the fundamental responsibility to protect the vulnerable rests upon the entire community, not solely upon law enforcement. Sarah Jennings lived a long, purposeful life after her ordeal, eventually marrying and establishing a family of her own. Though she always bore the visible and invisible scars of her years of captivity, she rarely spoke about her harrowing experience, preferring to concentrate on the present and the future that had been miraculously restored to her. But occasionally, in private conversations with those closest to her, she would mention that the most agonizing aspect was not the physical suffering or even the constant gnawing fear, but the pervasive feeling of having been utterly forgotten by the world, that perhaps no one was actively searching for her, that she might disappear completely without leaving any lasting imprint on anyone's memory. Her rescue proved that she had not been forgotten, that her family had never relinquished hope, and that there were indeed people willing to jeopardize their own safety to seek truth and administer justice. This profound realization, more than anything else, ultimately allowed her to rebuild a life imbued with meaning and purpose, transcending the trauma she had endured. The Halloway family saga remains one of the most profoundly disturbing cases in 19th century American history, a grim, enduring reminder that evil can manifest in the most unexpected of places. Lurking in the shadows of mountains, shielded by distance and communal silence. But it is also a narrative about the unwavering courage of men like Edmund Garrett and Elijah Broome, the indomitable resilience of survivors like Sarah Jennings, and the paramount importance of communities remaining perpetually vigilant in safeguarding their most vulnerable members. The Appalachian Mountains retained their majestic and breathtaking beauty, continuing to attract travelers and adventurers centuries after these events. But those intimately familiar with local history still view certain secluded valleys with a distinct sense of caution, still recount the tale of the Halloways at flickering campfires, still employ the story as a potent warning about the perils of disregarding signs of wrongdoing, of permitting fear or indifference to obstruct action when action is most desperately required. And somewhere within those ancient mountains, marked only by wild vegetation and moss-covered rocks, remains the site where the Halloway estate once stood, a place forgotten by the relentless march of time, yet not by the indelible imprint of memory, a silent, enduring reminder of a dark chapter that North Carolina would perhaps prefer to leave buried in the past, but which should never be entirely forgotten. If this extensive journey through one of the most profoundly disturbing cases in American history has resonated with you in any manner, please consider subscribing to the Macabre Fear Zone's channel for more in-depth investigative narratives concerning ancient mysteries and forgotten crimes that have irrevocably shaped our collective history. We genuinely appreciate your support and engagement. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this chilling case or suggesting other historical enigmas you would like to see meticulously explored. And importantly, activate your notification bell so you don't miss the next compelling investigations. We will bring from the shadowy depths of history into the illuminating light of knowledge.